The call came on Christmas morning. He was already awake, an old habit from decades of early shifts, of setting tables before the world got moving. His phone was on the kitchen counter. It rang. He picked it up. Someone spoke. And the word that came next took the floor out from under him. He reached for the counter's edge. His hand couldn't find it. He sat down on the kitchen floor and did not get up for a very long time. His name was Kyriakos Panayotou. He had come to England as a young man with almost nothing but the stubborn belief that work could build a life. He washed dishes. He waited tables. He smiled at customers who sometimes looked through him. He married a woman named Leslie, and together they built something small but real. A family, a home in North London that smelled like good food and felt like safety. And then his son was born, and everything changed. The boy was quiet and round-faced and dreamed in music. Georgios, his parents called him Georgios, not George, would disappear into his room and come back changed, as if some conversation had happened that no one else was invited to hear. His father watched him. He didn't always understand what he was seeing, but he worked harder. That was how he knew to love. Not in words, but in the hours he put in so his son would have choices he never had. When the boy decided music was everything, his father felt the first cold draft of something he couldn't name. A singer? A performer? That was not the life he had imagined. He had come from a place where men built things with their hands, where success was measured in what you could hold and count. And here was his son, wanting to stand on a stage and be seen. His father said little, but silence, sometimes, carries everything a man is afraid to say. Wham! Changed everything, not just for the world, but for the kitchen in North London, where his father sat watching it happen on television. The songs were everywhere. The face was everywhere. His quiet, round-faced Georgios was suddenly someone other people screamed for. Jack Panos sat with that. He did not know how to hold it. Pride and distance lived inside him at the same time. He didn't have words for what happens when you love someone you are not sure you fully know. George never stopped trying to reach him. Not with words. Words were hard between them. But with music. Every album was a conversation his father could not quite hear. And yet, on certain nights, alone in the kitchen after everyone was in bed, Jack would turn on the radio. If a George Michael song came on, he would sit very still. He would not get up. He would not change the station. That was his version of listening. George never knew. Then came 1998. And the world found out what George had been carrying his whole life. His father found out too. Not in a private conversation, not before the news, but through the same headlines everyone else read. That was the wound, not the truth itself. The way the truth arrived. Jack Panos sat in his kitchen, in the same chair he always sat in, and stared at the table. And something shifted inside him that would take years to name. George had been terrified of this moment his whole life. Not of who he was, he had always known, but of what his father's face would look like when the truth finally arrived. Of whether the man who had crossed the ocean to build a life for his family could hold this piece of it too. The silence that came from his father in those weeks was the loudest thing George had ever heard. And he had stood in rooms with 72,000 screaming people. They did not talk about it directly, not the way the world imagined. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reconciliation, No moment where everything came clear. Instead, there was the quiet, painful work of two men who loved each other and did not always know how, trying to find their way back to something that had never been entirely solid. Some silences between fathers and sons don't break. They just slowly soften, year by year, until they become something else. The years after 1998 were complicated for George in ways the public could not fully see. He was free, in a sense, and also untethered. The shame he had carried was gone, but the habits of hiding were still there. The instinct to protect the people he loved by keeping the most important things sealed away. His father was still in that kitchen, still sitting in his chair, and George was still, in some private part of himself, the boy listening outside the door. George Michael gave millions of people permission to feel what they had been hiding. He wrote songs about desire and grief and loneliness and longing that reached inside strangers and found exactly what they had kept sealed. He could do that for the world. For his own father, it was harder. The distance between what a man expresses on a stage and what he can say across a kitchen table, George carried that distance every single day. By the mid-2000s, there were softer moments. George would call. They would talk. Not about the deep things, not about the years of silence, but about ordinary matters, the kind of conversation that lets two people be near each other without touching the wound. His father was older now. George was older too. And sometimes something would ease between them. A shared laugh, a memory, a moment when the distance collapsed just enough for both of them to feel it. Christmas had always been complicated for George. In his later years, the holidays carried a heaviness. His mother had been gone since 1997, and that absence never left the season. His friends worried about him in December. He withdrew, and the man who had once lit up entire stadiums would sometimes spend the last days of the year utterly alone in a house that was beautiful and silent and full of music he no longer had the energy to play. Christmas Day, 2016. George Michael was 53 years old. He was at his home in Goring-on-Thames, a quiet village by the river, the kind of place you go when you are done with being watched. He had gone to bed the night before. He did not wake up. His heart had been struggling for years, quietly, beneath everything else. And on the morning the world was celebrating, the most famous voice of his generation simply stopped. His father was 82 years old. He had survived everything: the immigration, the poverty, the years of not understanding, the distance, the grief of losing Leslie, the complicated pride of watching his son become someone the world adored. He had survived all of it. And now someone was on the phone. And the word was coming. And there was nothing left in the world that could have prepared him for it. There is a grief that belongs only to parents, the grief of outliving a child. It does not matter how old the child is. It does not matter how much time has passed between you. The moment you hear those words, every age collapses at once. You see the round-faced boy in front of the record player. You see the teenager who hummed under his breath at the dinner table. You see every version of him you ever knew, all at once. And none of them come back. Jack Panos had not always known how to be the father his son needed. He knew that. Men of his generation carried love differently, in labor, in sacrifice, in the hours worked so that a family would not go without. Not in words, not in the conversations that needed to happen and never did. Whether he had regrets about the silences, the things he never said, the door he sometimes let stay closed. only he could know. And he never said. The world mourned George Michael the way the world mourns icons, with tributes and songs played at full volume. The radio played Faith. The television ran old Wham, clips from summer stages. Strangers gathered outside his home in Oxfordshire and wept for someone they had never met. And inside all of that noise, somewhere quiet, an 82-year-old man sat in a chair and held his grief the only way he knew how. In silence, without asking anyone for anything. Jack Panos would live for 6 more years, 6 more Christmases, 6 more winters without his son. People who knew him said he was never quite the same. But then, who would be? He was the father of George Michael. He was the man who had come to England with nothing and built a family that shook the world. And now, the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened in his life was gone, and he was left to carry it. Those 6 years were their own kind of story. The story no camera captured, no documentary ever told. An old man and his memories, and the radio. Songs that arrived in the middle of ordinary afternoons and stopped everything. A voice from a speaker that once belonged to a boy who stood in a North London hallway, listening to see if it was safe to come in. That voice was still everywhere. And that made it both easier and harder than anything Jack had ever survived. George Michael had asked, in his own way, to be understood. His whole career was a conversation, with the public, with the father who sat in that kitchen and listened to the radio in the dark. The songs were letters sent to a world that couldn't always write back. Some of those letters, the most important ones, were addressed to a man who received them but never quite found the words to respond. That was not cruelty. That was just the distance between 2 kinds of love. What is not often said about Jack Panos is this: he stayed. Through everything, the fame, the headlines, the complicated years, the grief, the silence, he stayed in his son's life. Imperfectly, incompletely, with gaps that could have swallowed a lesser love whole. But he stayed. And for a man who understood so little of the world his son inhabited, staying was its own kind of devotion. It was the only language he had. He used it until the end. Jack Panos passed away in 2022. He had outlived his son by 6 years. He had outlived his wife by 25. He left behind a legacy most people will never know, not in any song or headline, but in the private architecture of a family. The sacrifices that made a boy into an artist. The silences that shaped a man. The complicated love that fathers and sons carry without ever finding the right words. That is its own kind of music. It just doesn't have a name. George Michael wanted, more than anything, to be understood. Not celebrated. Understood. Somewhere in England, an old man listened to his son's voice on a small radio and felt something he couldn't name. Almost understanding, almost peace, almost the conversation they never managed. That feeling was real. That love was real. Nothing, no silence, no distance, ever changed that. Subscribe for the stories behind the music, the ones that never made the headlines, but always made the man. Today is Father's Day, and this story was never just about George Michael. It was about a man who crossed an ocean with empty hands and filled them with a family, who worked in kitchens and restaurants so his son could one day fill stadiums, who sat alone at night listening to the radio, his version of saying, "I love you." There are fathers like that everywhere. Men who never gave speeches. Men who never found the words. Men who showed up anyway, year after year, in the quiet ways the world never notices. This is for all of them, and especially for the ones who had to live on after. The ones who picked up a phone one morning and heard something no parent is ever ready to hear. Who got up the next day anyway, and the day after that, and kept going in that particular silence that only they understand. You are not forgotten, not today.